Good evening, friend. Find a comfortable position and let the room go quiet. If you are winding down for the night, this quiet room is a good place to do it. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breathing slow. Tonight, we are going somewhere hot, somewhere crowded, somewhere that smelled worse than almost anywhere in human history has ever smelled. But we are going there together, slowly, and you are safe in your own bed while we do it. The place is London. The year is 1858. And the thing that happened that summer was so strange, so specific, and so entirely its own kind of disaster, that historians still argue about how bad it really was. Some of them think it may have been the worst smell a major city has ever produced. Tonight we find out why, and we find out what it actually felt like to be a person in a body, wrapped in wool and steel, trying to survive it. Get settled. Dim the lights if you can. We have a long night of history ahead of us, and there is no reason to rush any of it. Tonight, we are going to follow an ordinary household through one of the strangest summers. The version of the Victorian era that most of us carry in our heads is a version built from paintings and period dramas. Parasols. Afternoon tea. Ladies in wide, elegant skirts stepping gracefully into carriages while gentlemen in tall hats tip their brims. It is a picture of restraint, order, and quiet dignity. The real version of that summer looked nothing like that at all. In June, July, and August of 1858, London endured a heatwave that broke every record anyone had bothered to keep. The heat itself would have been difficult enough, but the heat combined with something else, something that had been building for years underneath the city's polished surface, and the combination produced a public health emergency so severe that it briefly shut down the British government itself. It became known, quite simply, as the Great Stink. And by the time this night is over, you will understand exactly why that name was not an exaggeration. You will understand what it meant to wear 7 layers of fabric and whalebone in a heat that modern doctors would classify as dangerous. You will understand why an entire city drank from the same river it used as a toilet, and why the people who could have fixed the problem years earlier waited until the smell reached their own windows before they finally acted. Before we go further, if you enjoy settling into an evening like this, history that feels like a place you can visit rather than a page you have to memorize, it would help enormously if you took a moment to subscribe. It costs nothing, and it means we get to keep making these. If you like, tell me in the comments where you are tonight and what the weather is like where you are. I read every one. I hope, wherever you are, that the room around you is cooler than the one we are about to step into. Now, let us go to London, to the summer that a city almost could not survive, and it is late June 1858, and London has not seen rain in weeks. The sky overhead is a hard, bleached blue, cloudless morning after cloudless morning, and the sun climbs each day into a heat that the newspapers describe as almost tropical. On the 16th of June, the thermometer reaches 94.5 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade. In direct sun, in the enclosed courtyards and narrow streets where brick holds heat like an oven. Some accounts from that summer describe surfaces hot enough to blister skin. This is the hottest day London has recorded since anyone began keeping careful measurements, and it is only the beginning. The heat will not break for 2 more months. The streets themselves have changed character under this relentless sun. The horses that pull every cart, carriage, and omnibus through London's thoroughfares produce, on an ordinary day, an ordinary quantity of manure, which the street sweepers and the passing traffic gradually work into the cobblestones and the packed earth of less finished roads. In this heat, that manure dries almost immediately, breaking down under passing wheels and hooves into a fine, pale dust that hangs in the air of every busy street coating, shop fronts, settling on window ledges, working its way into the lungs of anyone who spends more than a few minutes outdoors. Combined with coal smoke from countless chimneys which continue burning even in summer, to heat water and cook food, and the general dust kicked up by a city of 2.5 million people going about their daily business, the outdoor air of London in this heat wave carries a texture that modern lungs would find almost unbreathable even before the specific horror of the river enters the equation. London in 1858 is the largest city on Earth. Over 2.5 million people live within its boundaries, packed into a landscape of brick terraces, narrow courts, market squares, and factory yards that have expanded faster than anyone could properly plan for. The population has roughly doubled in the last 50 years. Every service the city depends on, every drain, every road was built for a smaller London than the one that now exists, and nothing strains under that mismatch more than the system meant to carry away human waste. For centuries, London's answer to sewage was the cesspit. Nearly every house had one, a brick-lined pit beneath the building or in the yard behind it, into which the household's waste drained and simply sat. Men called night soil, men made their living by emptying these pits after dark, carting the contents out to farms beyond the city where it could be used eventually as fertilizer. It was a crude system and it smelled the way you would expect, but it worked in its limited way because the waste stayed contained. Then came the flush toilet. It arrived in fashionable London homes through the 1840 seconds and 1850 seconds as a genuine marvel of modern convenience, and thousands of households installed one as quickly as they could afford it. Nobody paused to ask where all that water, now surging through pipes with each flush, was actually going. The answer, in the vast majority of cases, was directly into the nearest sewer, and London sewers had never been designed to carry liquid waste anywhere except into the nearest local watercourse, into the Fleet, into the Tyburn, and ultimately all of it into the River Thames. The Thames runs through the heart of London, the way a spine runs through a body, and by 1858, that spine had become severely diseased. The river received the output of well over 2 million people relieving themselves multiple times a day. It received the runoff from slaughterhouses, where animal blood and offal were simply hosed into the nearest drain. It received the chemical discharge from tanneries, dye works, and gasworks that lined its banks. It received the waste of hospitals, of prisons, of schools. Every single thing that a city of that size produces and needed to be rid of, this one river was expected to carry away. Under ordinary circumstances, the tidal flow of the Thames diluted this waste enough that the horror of it remained mostly beneath the surface, both literally and in the public imagination. People understood that the river was foul. They did not fully grasp how foul, because the movement of the tide kept churning fresh water through twice a day, disguising the true concentration of what was accumulating. The heat wave of 1858 removed that disguise entirely. As the weeks of dry, relentless heat continued through June and into July, the water level of the Thames began to drop. Less water was flowing down from upstream to replenish what the tide carried in and out. The waste that had always been there, suspended and diluted, now had nowhere to go and nothing to dilute it. The river's banks, exposed as the water level fell, revealed mounds of solid sewage that in some places stood as high as 6 feet, baking in direct sun along the very heart of the city. And then the heat did what heat does to organic matter. It cooked it. The Thames stopped behaving like a river and started behaving like something closer to a vat, a slow, brown, viscous mass of fermenting waste, industrial runoff, and rotting animal matter. All of it working under the sun the way a compost pile works, except at a scale that stretched for miles through the most densely populated city on the planet. The smell that resulted has been described by the people who lived through it in terms that still, over a century and a half later, communicate something of its horror. One surgeon of the era described the river's appearance as black as ink. A leading newspaper called it a foul sewer, a stream of death, festering and reeking with abominable smells and threatening 3 million people with pestilence. Charles Dickens, who lived in London through that summer, had already described the Thames in his novel, published the year before, as a deadly sewer. And by the summer of 1858, the description had stopped being literary exaggeration and started being simple reporting. The smell did not stay near the river. Carried on whatever faint breeze existed in that airless summer, it moved through the streets, into homes, through open windows that people had opened in a desperate attempt to escape the indoor heat, only to discover that the outdoor air was worse. Accounts from the period claim the odor could be detected up to 8 miles from the river's banks. In the streets closest to the water, in Westminster and the surrounding neighborhoods, the smell was reportedly strong enough to make people physically ill. A wave of nausea that struck without warning and left grown men doubled over. We should spend a moment longer with the physical texture of this city, because the smell alone does not fully capture what it meant to move through London that summer. London, in 1858, is a city built almost entirely of brick, stone, and timber, materials that absorb heat through the long daylight hours of a Victorian summer, and then release it slowly through the night, so that the temperature inside a typical terraced house rarely falls much below the temperature outside, even at 3 or 4 in the morning. There is no such thing, anywhere in the city, as a truly cool room during this stretch of weather. The wealthy occupy larger houses with higher ceilings and thicker walls, which offer some marginal advantage, a few degrees of difference that matter more than they might sound. The poor occupy cramped, low-ceilinged rooms in buildings subdivided again and again to accommodate as many tenants as the landlord can extract rent from, rooms where the heat of cooking fires, the heat of neighboring bodies through thin walls, and the heat of the sun on an under-insulated roof combine into something close to unbearable. The river itself remains, despite everything, the city's primary artery of commerce and transportation. Barges move coal, timber, grain, and manufactured goods along its length every day. Their bargemen working in direct proximity to water that has become, by any modern medical standard, a serious biohazard. Watermen still ferry passengers across and along the river for a fee, a trade that has existed in London for centuries and shows little sign of pausing, simply because the water beneath the boats has turned into something closer to liquid rot. Fishermen, remarkably, still occasionally attempt to work sections of the river, though the fish populations that once made the Thames a genuine source of food for the city have collapsed dramatically over the preceding decades, unable to survive in water this thoroughly poisoned by industrial and human waste. The bridges spanning the Thames, Westminster Bridge, Blackfriars, London Bridge, become, during the worst weeks of the heatwave, places that pedestrians cross as quickly as possible, rather than places to pause and admire the view, as guidebooks of earlier decades had once recommended visitors do. The exposed mudflats beneath these bridges at low tide reveal the full, undisguised horror of what the river actually contains. A landscape of dark, glistening sludge dotted with debris that no one examines too closely. Dot-releasing gases that occasionally bubble visibly to the surface in a manner that several contemporary observers describe with a kind of horrified fascination, as though the river itself were breathing. The river traffic that depends on the Thames for its livelihood adapts in its own quiet way to conditions that would have seemed unthinkable only a few years earlier. Bargemen work with cloths tied over their faces, where practical, though the practice offers only marginal relief against a smell this concentrated. Some captains, where their cargo and schedule allow it, choose to make their passages at night, reasoning with a logic that owes more to folk wisdom than to any genuine understanding of temperature and evaporation, that the cooler night air somehow tempers the worst of the stench. Belief that several accounts suggest held at least a grain of practical truth, since the lower nighttime temperatures did slightly reduce the rate at which the exposed waste continued to ferment and release its worst vapors. The economics of this crisis are worth pausing over as well, because they explain a great deal about why the problem had been allowed to reach this scale in the first place. London's growth throughout the first half of the 19th century had been driven by industrialization and the accompanying migration of workers from the countryside into the city, seeking employment in factories, in the docks, in the countless trades that a growing metropolis requires, drawn by wages that, modest as they were, still exceeded what most could earn tilling land that had belonged to their families for generations. This growth generated enormous wealth for the city as a whole, but the infrastructure meant to support that population, the sewers, the water supply, the basic sanitary systems that a city of this size actually required, had not grown at anything close to the same pace. Part of the difficulty lay in how London was governed. Unlike a modern city with a single unified municipal authority, London in 1858 was administered by a patchwork of parishes, vestries, and local boards, each responsible for a fragment of the metropolis, each jealously guarding its own limited budget and its own narrow jurisdiction. A sewer built by one parish might empty directly into a neighboring parish's water supply, and no single body possessed the authority to compel a comprehensive, city-wide solution. The Metropolitan Board of Works, established only a few years earlier specifically to address this fragmentation, still lacked the borrowing power and the political mandate to force through a project as large as Bazalgette's plan without direct parliamentary authorization. It took a very specific and very unpleasant catalyst to finally secure. Building a comprehensive new sewer system was understood, even before 1858, to require a capital investment running into the millions of pounds, an amount that no single parish or borough could reasonably shoulder alone, and the fractured, overlapping system of local governance that administered different portions of London meant that no single authority possessed both the responsibility and the resources to act unilaterally. Almost no one possessed the combined power and incentive to actually solve it. The public mood, meanwhile, moved through its own progression that summer, from complaint to alarm to a kind of dark, weary humor that Londoners have always been especially skilled at producing under genuine duress. The satirical magazine Punch, widely read across the middle classes, published a series of cartoons that sum up personifying the Thames as a filthy, menacing figure, sometimes depicted introducing his children, given names like diphtheria, gropfula, and cholera, to the fashionable ladies and gentlemen of the city, a grim visual joke that captured, better than any official report, the specific blend of horror and gallows humor with which ordinary Londoners were processing a crisis that had moved well beyond the reach of easy solutions. Newspapers reported with an evident note of satisfaction that barely concealed years of frustrated advocacy every fresh indignity suffered by the members of Parliament who had for so long treated the river's condition as someone else's problem to solve. This is the world our family lives in tonight. Let us go and meet them. The household we are going to follow tonight is a composite drawn from the real diaries, letters, and household accounts of middle-class Londoners who lived through the summer of 1858. We are going to call them the Pembertons. Edmund Pemberton is 29 years old. He works as a committee clerk in the Houses of Parliament, a respectable if unglamorous position that involves managing correspondence, recording minutes, and assisting the members of various parliamentary committees with the endless paperwork that Victorian government generates. It is not a position of power, but it is a position of proximity to power. And proximity, as Edmund is about to discover this summer, has its own specific costs. Edmund's wife is Louisa, 26 years old, the daughter, the schoolmaster from Kent, who married into what her mother considered a very satisfactory arrangement, with a young man of steady employment and reasonable prospect. Louisa keeps the household with the help of a single maid of all work, a girl of 17 named Bridget, who does the cooking, the cleaning, and most of the physical labor that a respectable household requires, but that a respectable lady is not expected to perform herself. The Pembertons live in a narrow terraced house in Pimlico, a relatively new neighborhood of stucco-fronted homes built to house the growing ranks of London's clerks, civil servants, and professional men. Their house sits perhaps a 15-minute walk from Westminster, close enough that Edmund can walk to his office each morning, close enough this same summer that the smell of the river reaches their windows on the days when the wind sits in the wrong direction. They have one child, a daughter named Alice, not yet 2 years old, the kind of small, curious presence that fills a modest house with noise and requires constant watchful attention, especially in a summer when the heat itself has become a genuine danger to a small child's body. Infant and early childhood mortality in Victorian London remains high even in an ordinary year, and Louisa is acutely, sometimes painfully aware that small children are among the most vulnerable to both extreme heat and the waterborne illnesses that flourish in exactly the conditions this summer has produced. She has already lost one pregnancy before Alice was safely born, a private grief she rarely speaks of, but that has left her, if anything, more watchful over her surviving daughter than a woman with an easier path to motherhood might otherwise be. Louisa's days are structured around a routine that would be recognizable to any middle-class Victorian wife. She manages the household accounts. She plans meals, which in this summer of failing food supplies has become an unusually difficult task. She sees to Alice's care, to the mending, to the correspondence that maintains her connections with family and friends. She is, by the standards of her class and her era, a woman living a life of considerable comfort compared to the vast majority of London's population. She has a servant. She has a husband with steady income. She does not labor in a factory or take in washing to survive. And yet, as we are about to see, comfort in 1858 did not mean safety, and status did not mean relief from the physical realities that a heat wave and a poisoned river inflict on everybody in the city, regardless of the address on the front door. One detail that makes Louisa feel real to us rather than merely a type is her private, slightly guilty habit of reading the serialized novels published in weekly magazines, tucked away from her husband's occasional teasing about frivolous reading. Though in truth Edmund enjoys them nearly as much as she does, and often asks what happens next before she has finished the latest installment. It is a small, human thing, a woman with a private pleasure that has nothing to do with duty or propriety, and it will matter later tonight in a small and quiet way when we return to her in the dark. The Pembertons' house itself deserves a moment of description, because it tells us something about the specific rung of the social ladder they occupy. It is a narrow, 4-story terraced house, one of dozens built in an identical row along the same street, each with a small front area separated from the pavement by iron railings, a servant's entrance below street level, and a modest garden at the back, barely large enough for the vegetable patch that has become this summer. Dawn, unexpectedly important source of trusted food. The front parlor, where the family receives any visitors of note, is furnished with pieces that Louisa's mother contributed as part of her wedding settlement. Solid, respectable furniture that speaks of a household maintaining appearances just above the line of genuine anxiety about money. Edmund's income from his clerkship is steady but not generous, something in the range of £150 a year, enough to maintain the household, to pay Bridget's modest annual wages of perhaps £12 plus board, to keep Alice in the small necessities a growing child requires, but not enough to permit the kind of luxuries. Ice for the pantry, a larger house with taller ceilings and thicker walls, a country retreat to escape to during a crisis like this one, that a wealthier family might take entirely for granted. A single block of imported ice, delivered to a fashionable household for a single evening's entertaining, might cost more than Bridget earns in a month, a comparison that Louisa has never made explicitly but that sits, unspoken, beneath every decision the household makes about how to spend its limited resources. This positions the Pembertons in an especially interesting place within the story of the Great Stink. They are comfortable enough to have real advantages over London's poor, a garden, a servant, some capacity to be selective about food. But they are not so comfortable that those advantages come anywhere close to eliminating the danger. They occupy the vast, uncertain middle ground of Victorian London, close enough to genuine security to feel it should be within reach, and close enough to genuine risk to feel its breath on the back of the neck every single day. Edmund himself is a serious young man, ambitious in a quiet, patient way, rather than a flashy one, hoping that steady diligence in his current position might eventually lead to advancement within the parliamentary civil service, a path that would offer his family greater security than his current modest salary provides. He takes his work seriously, reads the newspapers each morning with genuine attention rather than mere habit, and has developed, over his 3 years working within the walls of Westminster, a somewhat more informed and more troubled understanding of the true scale of London's sanitary problems than most ordinary Londoners possess. This knowledge does not comfort him. If anything, it deepens his private worry, because he understands in a way that Louisa can only sense intuitively exactly how many years the warning signs have been accumulating, and exactly how little has actually been done about any of them. This specific day, the day we are going to follow closely, falls in the middle of July, near the peak of the crisis, when the heat has been unbroken for nearly a month and the smell from the river has become, according to Edmund's own account in a letter to his brother, worse than anything he believed a city could produce and still continue functioning. We begin in the morning because the morning in a heatwave is often the only bearable part of the day, and even that bearable window is closing fast. Louisa wakes just after 5, before the household has properly stirred, because the bedroom she shares with Edmund has already become uncomfortably warm, and sleep is no longer offering any real relief. The windows are open, both of them, but the air moving through offers little comfort. It carries faintly but unmistakably note of something foul, something that reminds Louisa of spoiled meat left too long in a larder, and she has learned over the past weeks not to dwell on identifying it too closely. She rises quietly so as not to wake Edmund, who does not need to be at Westminster until 9, but who sleeps poorly in this heat and deserves whatever additional rest he can manage. She crosses to check on Alice in the small, adjoining room and finds the child already stirring, her hair damp against her forehead, her small nightgown clinging to her skin. Heat like this is dangerous for a child so young, and Louisa has spent the past several weeks in a state of low, persistent worry that she tries not to let show on her face. She has heard, through the network of servants and neighbors that carries news faster than any newspaper, of children in the poorer parts of the city falling seriously ill, and though she tells herself that the Pembertons' relative comfort offers some protection, she is not entirely certain. Dressing is the first genuine ordeal of the day, and it will not be the last. Bridget arrives to help, as she does every morning, and the two women move through the familiar practiced sequence with a kind of grim efficiency that has replaced whatever pleasure Louisa once took in the ritual of getting dressed. First comes the chemise, a simple linen undergarment worn against the skin, already faintly damp before Louisa has done anything more strenuous than stand still. Over this go the drawers, another layer of linen. Then the corset, stiffened with rows of whalebone, which Bridget laces from behind, pulling the fabric snug enough to shape Louisa's waist into the fashionable silhouette, but not so tight as to be truly painful. This is a point of some pride for Louisa. She has heard of women who lace themselves to the point of fainting, and finds the practice both foolish and faintly pathetic, evidence of vanity outweighing sense. Her own corset is laced firmly but sensibly, and she tells herself this makes a meaningful difference, though in a heat like this, sensible lacing and foolish lacing produce more similar results than she would like to admit. Over the corset comes a corset cover, another layer of cotton meant to protect the outer garments from the whalebone and to smooth the silhouette further. Then the crinoline, the great cage of flexible steel hoops that has largely replaced the heavy layered petticoats of previous decades. This is, in its way, an improvement. The crinoline is lighter than the 6 or 7 petticoats it replaced, and it allows air to circulate somewhat more freely around the legs than solid layers of fabric would. But it is also an enormous unwieldy structure that Louisa must learn to navigate through doorways, around furniture, and into the family's small carriage without catching it on anything or tipping it in an unfortunate direction. Over the crinoline goes at least 1 petticoat, sometimes 2, depending on the fashion of the specific dress, to soften the outline of the steel hoops beneath the outer skirt. The crinoline itself deserves a moment's attention because it represents one of the odder ironies of this entire story. When it was introduced in the mid-1852s, replacing the older fashion of 6 or 7 separate layered petticoats stiffened with horsehair, it was widely marketed and understood as an improvement, a lighter, cooler alternative to the sheer physical weight that women had been carrying for years. And in a narrow, literal sense, this was true. The crinoline weighs less than a stack of heavy petticoats, and it allows some air to move around the legs in a way that solid fabric never could. But the crinoline solved one problem while creating several others. Its enormous circumference, sometimes spanning 6 feet across, meant that Louisa must navigate doorways sideways, must take special care descending stairs, must learn an entirely new set of physical habits, simply to move through her own house without catching the steel structure on a table leg or a doorframe. Newspapers of the era are full of accounts, some tragic, some merely embarrassing, of women whose crinolines caught fire from an unguarded hearth or candle, the wide skirt acting as a kind of wick that carried flame upward with terrifying speed. Louisa has heard of at least 2 such deaths within her own social circle's periphery, stories that circulate at social gatherings with a certain hushed intensity, and she has become, if anything, more cautious around open flame since hearing them, an added source of vigilance layered on top of everything else this summer already demands of her attention. And then, finally, the dress itself. A day dress suitable for July, made of a lighter cotton print than the heavier silks and wools of winter, but still a substantial garment with long sleeves, a high close collar, and a fitted bodice that closes with a long row of small buttons up the back. The sleeves cannot be shortened, the collar cannot be loosened. A respectable woman does not show her arms or her throat in public, regardless of the temperature. And the social consequence of appearing improperly dressed is a currency that matters more to Louisa's daily existence than almost anything else. By the time Bridget fastens the last button, Louisa has been standing in the growing morning heat for the better part of 40 minutes, wearing what amounts to 7 distinct layers of fabric, steel, and whalebone. She is already sweating, a fact she can feel but cannot address, because there is no acceptable way for a Victorian lady to acknowledge, let alone alleviate, her own perspiration in polite company. She simply endures it, the way she has endured it every morning for the past month, and moves on to the next task of the day. Bridget, meanwhile, dresses in her own version of this same discomfort, though her clothing carries somewhat less structural rigidity than her mistress's. Since a servant girl's practical labor requires a measure of physical freedom, Bridget wears no crinoline while working, finding the great steel cage entirely impractical for the bending, lifting, and kneeling her daily chores require, and she has quietly, without discussion, adopted a somewhat lighter version of the corset than fashion would strictly dictate. Compromise between propriety and function that a girl of her station is granted rather more latitude to make than a lady of Louisa's would be. Even so, Bridget spends the morning laboring over the kitchen fire, which must be kept burning regardless of the outdoor temperature, because there is no other way to boil water, to cook the family's food, or to heat the iron Louisa will need for pressing linens later in the week. And the combination of an already blistering morning with the additional heat of an open kitchen fire makes Bridget's corner of the house, by common household agreement, the single most punishing place to spend any extended stretch of time. Bridget herself sleeps in a small room at the top of the house, tucked beneath the roofline where the summer heat gathers and lingers long after the rest of the house has begun to cool in the small hours before dawn. It is, by any honest measure, the worst room in the building, hot in summer and cold in winter, and Bridget occupies it not out of any deliberate unkindness on the Pembertons' part, but simply because this is where servants' quarters have always been placed in houses of this design, tucked away close to the roof that bakes all day in the sun and releases its stored heat only grudgingly through the brief hours of relative dark. She rises before Louisa most mornings, having already lit the kitchen fire and begun the day's first tasks before her mistress has even opened her eyes, and she will not finish her own duties until well after the family has retired for the night. A working day considerably longer and considerably more physically demanding than anything Louisa herself is asked to endure. Bridget's own family, back in a small town in Ireland that she has not seen in 3 years, would consider her position here, cramped attic room and punishing hours, notwithstanding, a genuine step up in the world, and in her more exhausted moments this same summer, even as she privately wonders whether any of them fully understand what the step actually cost. Breakfast should be a simple matter, but this summer it has become its own small crisis. Louisa goes down to the kitchen to find Bridget already frowning over the morning's milk delivery. The bottle, left on the step before dawn, has soured. This has happened with increasing frequency as the heat has continued, because milk in 1858 travels from cow to household through a chain of handling that offers no refrigeration at any point, and a journey that might have taken hours in cooler weather now curdles the milk before it ever reaches the doorstep. The milk trade itself is worth understanding in a little more detail, because it illustrates exactly how a heat wave can transform an ordinary daily convenience into a genuine hazard. Much of London's milk in 1858 comes from dairies located within the city itself, cows kept in cramped urban sheds and fed on the leftover mash from breweries and distilleries rather than fresh grass. The cows themselves often kept in conditions so poor and so poorly ventilated that their own health suffered visibly, a fact that would have alarmed Louisa considerably had she ever seen the sheds in question, rather than simply the bottle that arrived each morning. The milk is carried by hand or in small carts to households across the city, often sitting exposed to open air and rising temperatures for hours between the moment it leaves the cow and the moment it reaches a family's breakfast table. Under ordinary summer conditions, this system, imperfect as it is, generally functions. In the extraordinary heat of July 1858, it fails with increasing regularity, and the milkmen, aware that spoiled milk represents lost income, have every financial incentive to disguise the problem rather than admit to it. Even when the milk arrives fresh, Louisa has learned to regard it with a certain wariness that would have seemed excessive a year ago. She has read, with growing unease, newspaper accounts of the tricks that dishonest dairymen use to stretch their supply and disguise spoilage, adding water to increase volume, adding chalk to restore a convincing whiteness, and in the worst cases, adding substances whose only purpose is to mask the smell and taste of milk. She cannot know, standing in her kitchen with a jug of milk, she does not entirely trust exactly what has been added to it. She only knows that trusting it fully feels like a small act of faith she is no longer certain she can afford, especially with a child in the house. This morning, Bridget pours the soured milk down the drain without ceremony, and Louisa sends her out to a different supplier 2 streets over, one whose reputation for honesty has, in Louisa's careful observation over recent weeks, held up somewhat better than most, though even this trusted source cannot entirely guarantee freshness in weather like this. Alice will have to make do with plain bread and a small portion of the previous day's butter, itself kept as cool as the household's modest larder allows, which is to say, not nearly cool enough for genuine comfort, but cooler, at least, than the kitchen proper. The meat is worse. Bridget returns from the butcher later that morning, having walked the short distance in heat that has already, by 9 o'clock, become oppressive, and reports that the butcher's store smelled of decay before she had even reached the counter. Without refrigeration, meat in a heat wave begins to spoil within hours of slaughter, and butchers across the city are engaged in their own quiet, invisible battle against the clock, trying to sell each day's stock before the heat renders it inedible, or worse, before it becomes something that will sicken whoever eats it and no one notices in time. Louisa makes her decisions carefully. Bread, which keeps reasonably well. Eggs purchased that morning and inspected individually, held to the light and gently shaken. A small folk test she learned from her own mother, and trusts rather more than she probably should. Vegetables from the small kitchen garden behind the house, trusted because she has watched them grow herself. She avoids the meat entirely today, a decision that will mean a plainer dinner than she would prefer, but a decision she has made with increasing frequency as the summer has worn on, because the alternative risk feels, to her, no longer worth the improved variety of the evening meal. It is a small, quiet exercise of judgment that Louisa performs almost automatically now, a set of private calculations about risk and trust that would have seemed entirely unnecessary to her a year earlier, and that she suspects correctly. From the grandest townhouse to the humblest tenement room, each household weighing the same impossible question of what, exactly, is safe to eat. By mid-morning, the heat inside the house has become truly uncomfortable, and Louisa makes the decision that she makes most days now, to walk with Alice to the small square nearby, where there is at least the illusion of open air, even if the air itself carries faintly the smell that has become the defining sensory experience of this entire summer. She dresses the child as lightly as decency allows, gathers her own gloves and bonnet, an essential piece of outdoor attire regardless of the heat, and steps out into a London that has, in the space of 1 month, become almost unrecognizable to itself. Let us stop here for a moment and talk about what Louisa's clothing actually is doing to her body, because it is worth understanding in more detail than most people ever consider. The 7 layers we just described are not simply uncomfortable in the way that a heavy sweater is uncomfortable on a warm day. They represent a comprehensive interruption of the body's own cooling system. Human bodies regulate temperature, primarily through perspiration, sweat evaporating from the skin's surface and carrying heat away with it. This system depends entirely on air movement across the skin. When that air movement is blocked, when the skin is instead sealed beneath layer after layer of linen, whalebone, steel, and cotton, the sweat has nowhere to evaporate to. Simply accumulates, soaking into the fabric closest to the body, and the cooling effect that the sweat was meant to produce never actually happens. The body continues to sweat, sometimes even more profusely as it tries and fails to cool itself, while the core temperature continues climbing, regardless. This is not a minor design flaw. It is a fundamental mismatch between the demands of Victorian fashion and the basic thermodynamics of the human body, and in ordinary summer weather, this mismatch produced discomfort. In the extraordinary heat of 1858, it produced genuine medical danger. Heat exhaustion, characterized by weakness, dizziness, nausea, and profuse sweating, was almost certainly common among women dressed as Louisa is dressed, though the medical understanding of the time had no clear framework for diagnosing it as a distinct condition. Fainting, which the Victorian era treated as a nearly fashionable ailment, a delicate feminine weakness attributed to nerves or sensibility, was in many documented cases something closer to a straightforward physiological response to overheating and dehydration. The corset compounded this danger in a second, more direct way. Beyond simply trapping heat, even laced to what Louisa considers a sensible degree, the whalebone structure restricts the natural expansion of the ribcage with each breath, meaning the lungs cannot draw in quite as much air as they would unrestricted. Under ordinary conditions, the body compensates for this without much difficulty. Under conditions of extreme heat, when the body's oxygen demand rises as the heart works harder to pump blood toward the skin's surface, an attempt to shed excess warmth, a restricted ribcage becomes a meaningfully greater handicap. The corset also presses directly against the stomach, digestive organs, a compression that Victorian women learned to live with as an unremarkable fact of daily existence, but one that made eating a full meal in the middle of a hot day truly uncomfortable, contributing to the pattern of light. Too inadequate eating that further weakened women's resilience against heat exhaustion, precisely when their bodies needed nourishment and strength the most. And the dehydration itself deserves particular attention, because it was compounded by something that sounds almost unbelievable to modern ears. Victorian women, particularly those of the middle and upper classes, were actively discouraged from drinking too much water during the day, out of a concern that doing so would make them perspire more visibly, and visible perspiration was considered unrefined, evidence of a body failing to maintain the composed, controlled appearance that respectability demanded. A woman was expected to appear cool and collected, regardless of the actual temperature of her body, and one of the ways she was taught to manage this appearance was by simply consuming less liquid, which meant that many women moved through the hottest days of that summer in a state of chronic, self-imposed dehydration, compounding a heat exposure that was already dangerous on its own. Louisa herself has absorbed this lesson so thoroughly that she barely registers it as a choice anymore. When Bridget offers her a cup of water mid-morning on the walk back from the square, Louisa's instinct is to take only a small, careful sip, rather than the full cup her body is actually asking for, a habit formed over years of subtle social conditioning rather than any conscious daily decision. It is only later, when Alice grows visibly flushed and lethargic in the heat, that Louisa insists the child drink as much water as she wants, applying to her daughter a standard of care that she has never once applied to her own body, because a small child's thirst carries none of the social weight that an adult woman's does. The social stakes surrounding this clothing were not abstract. Woman who removed her jacket in public, who loosened her collar, who allowed even a glimpse of her forearms or her throat to be visible in a public setting, risked a form of social punishment that could follow her for years. Victorian respectability operated as a kind of currency, and a woman's visible modesty was one of its primary units of exchange. Appearing undressed, even in the mildest sense of simply adjusting one layer of an otherwise fully covered outfit, could be read as a signal of moral looseness, of a woman who did not properly respect the codes that held her social world together. The consequences rippled outward. A husband's professional standing could suffer if his wife was perceived as improper. A daughter's marriage prospects could be damaged by even a whisper of impropriety attached to her mother. And so women suffered in silence, because the alternative, a moment of visible relief purchased at the cost of social standing, was simply not a trade that most of them were willing or able to make. Men's fashion, though less physically restrictive than women's, carried its own considerable burden. A gentleman of Edmund's class was expected to wear a heavy wool frock coat. Regardless of the season, a high stiff collar could chafe and constrict in the heat. The top hat, constructed of felted material that trapped heat directly against the scalp and skull. There is more to understand here about why men endured this. The frock coat and the top hat were not merely fashion choices. They were uniforms of professional respectability, signals that a man belonged to the educated, employed, socially legitimate class of London society. Removing the coat in public, appearing in shirt sleeves, was almost as unthinkable for a man of Edmund's position as removing a layer of clothing would have been for Louisa. Some physicians of the era, in fact, had already begun quietly noting a rise in cases of what they termed heat apoplexy among gentlemen who spent long hours in the direct sun wearing the standard professional uniform of coat and hat, though these observations circulated mainly within medical circles and did little to change the prevailing fashion of the day. Heat did not discriminate by gender, but the social codes governing how each gender was permitted to respond to that heat certainly did, and neither set of codes offered much genuine relief. And there was, in any case, almost nowhere to find relief even for those willing to risk propriety. There was no mechanical cooling of any kind available to ordinary households in 1858. No fans beyond the handheld variety, which stirred warm air without actually cooling it. No refrigeration beyond what a very wealthy household might achieve with blocks of ice, imported at considerable expense from lakes in Norway, or from the American ice trade that shipped blocks cut from frozen New England ponds across the Atlantic in insulated holds. The finest of this imported ice, sold under names like Wenham Lake ice, had become, in the years just before this heat wave, a genuine status symbol among London's wealthiest households, celebrated for its remarkable clarity, reportedly so pure that a person could read a newspaper through a block of it 2 feet thick. Queen Victoria herself was said to insist upon it for her own household. But ice of this kind was a luxury reserved for the wealthiest households in London. used to chill drinks at fashionable dinner parties, or to preserve delicate foods for a matter of hours rather than days. For a family like the Pembertons, comfortable but solidly middle class, ice was an occasional indulgence rather than a practical tool for surviving a heatwave. And opening a window, the single most obvious and universally available method of seeking relief from indoor heat, carried its own specific penalty this same summer. Opening a window did not bring in cool air. It brought in the smell of the river, the pervasive, inescapable stench that had settled over the entire city like a physical presence. And so Londoners across every social class found themselves facing an impossible choice between suffocating heat behind closed windows. There was, in the truest sense, no way to simply breathe comfortably in London that summer. We return now to Louisa, walking through the square with her daughter, because the details of that walk will show us exactly what this impossible choice looked like in practice. It is nearly 11 in the morning when Louisa steps outside, and the heat has already settled over the city. Like something with physical weight, the cobblestones radiate warmth through the soles of her boots. The horses pulling carts and carriages along the street move with a visible, labored slowness, their coats dark with sweat, and the mania they leave behind bakes almost immediately in the sun, breaking down into a fine, choking dust that rises with every passing wheel and settles over everything, over Louisa's skirts, over Alice's small bonnet, over the surfaces of shop windows and doorsteps alike. And beneath all of this, underneath the ordinary smells of a Victorian city street, horses and coal smoke and the yeasty warmth of a nearby bakery, sits the other smell, the one that has become impossible to escape anywhere within several miles of the river. It arrives in waves rather than as a constant presence, carried on whatever faint movement of air exists in the breathless heat. And when it arrives with a force that Louisa has learned to brace herself against. She has described it in a letter to her sister as something between rotting eggs and the worst outhouse she has ever encountered, magnified to a scale that makes the comparison feel almost inadequate. Other Londoners of the era reach for equally desperate comparisons, describing it as a smell that seemed less like an odor and more like an assault, something that struck the body physically rather than simply registering in the nose. A leading surgeon of the period, writing about his own experience of the smell that summer, struggled to find adequate language for it at all, eventually settling on the observation that whoever once inhaled it could never entirely forget it and could count themselves fortunate simply to have lived long enough afterward to remember it. Alice, too young to understand what she is smelling or why, wrinkles her small face and begins to fuss, and Louisa quickens her pace toward the square, where at least the presence of trees and a small patch of grass offers the illusion, if not the reality, of cleaner air. She passes other women out on similar errands, all of them dressed in the same 7 layers, all of them moving with the same careful, deliberate pace that heavy fabric and steel hoops require. All of them, Louisa suspects, suffering the same silent discomfort behind composed and pleasant expressions. This is one of those details that changes the picture entirely. The Victorian street, so often imagined as a scene of leisurely elegance, was in the summer of 1858 a landscape of women enduring genuine physical distress while performing, with tremendous discipline, the appearance of untroubled calm. At the market, where Louisa stops to see whether any acceptable meat has arrived since Bridget's disappointing report earlier that morning, the smell is worse still, mixing with the specific odor of a butcher's stall in heat. And Louisa finds herself holding a handkerchief lightly against her nose, a small, permissible gesture that stops just short of the impropriety of openly displaying distress. The butcher, a heavy-set man who Louisa has patronized for years, looks exhausted in a way she has not seen before, and admits, when she asks after his stock, that he has been forced to throw away more meat this month than he can ever remember discarding in a single summer. He does not need to say what would happen to a family that ate meat past the point where it should have been discarded. Everyone in London that summer understood, in a general and frightened way, that spoiled food and the diseases spreading through the poorer districts were somehow connected, even if the precise mechanism remained a matter of considerable dispute. The market itself, on an ordinary summer morning in an ordinary year, would be a scene of considerable liveliness. Vendors calling out their wares, customers haggling over prices, the general noise and motion of urban commerce proceeding at its usual busy pace. This July, the market feels subdued in a way that Louisa finds almost more unsettling than open panic would be. Vendors speak in lower voices. Customers move more quickly between stalls, lingering less than they might in cooler weather, eager to complete their errands and retreat indoors, even though indoors offers its own version of the same misery. A fishmonger 2 stalls down from the butcher has simply closed for the day. A hand-lettered sign explaining that his stock could not be trusted in this heat, an admission of honesty that Louisa finds she respects rather more than she resents the inconvenience it causes her. Prices, too, have crept upward this month, a fact that Louisa notes with quiet concern as she tallies the morning's small purchases against the household budget she manages so carefully. Reduced supply, as vendors discard more spoiled stock than usual, combines with steady demand to push the cost of reliably fresh food higher than it has been at any point earlier this year, a burden that falls hardest, as such burdens always do, on households with the least room to absorb it. For the Pembertons, the increase means small adjustments and careful economizing elsewhere. For families with less margin than theirs, it means harder choices still, between food that might be spoiled and food that might simply not be affordable at all. She notices, as she makes her way between stalls, an unusual number of women dressed as she is dressed, moving with the same careful, deliberate gait that a crinoline demands. All of them, she suspects, enduring some version of the same private discomfort behind expressions schooled into pleasant composure. There is a strange kind of solidarity in this, unspoken and never directly acknowledged, a shared understanding among the women of her class that everyone present is suffering quietly, and everyone present is doing her best not to show it. A young mother near the bread stall dabs discreetly at her temple with a folded handkerchief. An older woman, clearly struggling more than most with the heat, pauses to steady herself against a low wall, waves off a concerned inquiry from a nearby stallholder, and continues on her way, determined not to make a scene of what has almost certainly been a genuine bout of dizziness brought on by the temperature and the weight of her clothing. Alice, growing increasingly fretful in the heat despite Louisa's best efforts to keep her comfortable, finally begins to cry in earnest as they near the small square, and Louisa, mindful of the picture this presents but truly more concerned for her daughter's well-being than for any passing judgment, unfastens the top button of the child's small dress, allowing a slightly greater degree of air to reach her overheated skin. This small act, permissible for a child in a way it would never be permissible for an adult woman, offers Alice some modest relief, and the two of them find a bench beneath one of the square's few substantial trees where the shade provides at least a marginal reduction, if nothing at all, in the way of relief from the smell that continues to drift through even this small green pocket of the city. While Louisa navigates the market and the square, Edmund is 3 miles away, seated at his desk in the Houses of Parliament, enduring a version of this same summer that carries its own distinct, magnified horror. The Houses of Parliament, rebuilt only a decade earlier after a catastrophic fire destroyed the old building, sit directly on the bank of the Thames, close enough that the river laps, quite literally, against the foundations of the terrace where members of Parliament traditionally take their afternoon air. This proximity, a point of pride when the building was designed, has become, in the summer of 1858, an inescapable curse. The smell that reaches Louisa's Square in occasional bearable waves reaches Parliament in a constant, overwhelming assault because there is simply no distance between the legislative heart of the British Empire and the fermenting river that produces the stench. Edmund's work that day involves assisting with the preparation of documents for a committee session scheduled for the early afternoon, a task that under ordinary circumstances would occupy him without much drama. But the committee room in question faces the river, and by midday, the heat and the smell together have made the room truly difficult to occupy for any extended period. Edmund describes in the same letter to his brother that Louisa will read aloud to him later that week with a mixture of horror and dark amusement, watching a senior member of the committee rise mid-session, press a handkerchief firmly against his face, and simply leave, offering no explanation beyond a muttered comment about the intolerable atmosphere. Edmund's own desk sits in a smaller office adjoining the main committee corridor, a room that does not face the river directly, but that nonetheless receives the smell whenever a door opens nearby, a fresh wave arriving each time a member or a clerk passes through on their way to or from the affected chambers. He has developed, over the preceding weeks, a habit of breathing shallowly through his mouth during these moments, a small, private accommodation that he suspects half the building staff have adopted independently, though no one discusses it openly, because to acknowledge the problem too directly feels like an admission of weakness unbecoming a man meant to serve the machinery of government with quiet, unflappable competence. A few of the older clerks, men who have served through several previous summers of lesser but still noticeable river odor, have taken to keeping small vials of scented oil in their desk drawers, dabbing a little beneath the nose during the worst hours of the afternoon. A practice Edmund has so far resisted adopting himself, though he privately admits, on the same letter to his brother, that he understands the impulse rather better with each passing week. The morning's correspondence includes, among the usual volume of petitions and requests that cross a committee clerk's desk, no fewer than 3 separate letters from concerned citizens demanding that Parliament finally take action on the state of the river. Letters that Edmund is required to log and forward according to standard procedure, but that he finds himself reading with rather more personal sympathy than the dry formalities of his position typically permit. One letter, from a physician practicing in Southwark, describes in careful clinical detail the rising number of cholera cases his practice has treated over the preceding fortnight, and closes with a plea that reads, "Considerably more urgent and considerably better argued than most of the official memoranda that cross his desk in an ordinary week. This is not an isolated incident." Accounts from across the parliamentary session that summer describe members repeatedly abandoning committee rooms and portions of the library that face the river, driven out by a stench so severe that several members reported genuine nausea, and at least a few reportedly required medical attention after prolonged exposure to rooms where the smell had become concentrated. Even the royal household was not spared. Queen Victoria herself had arranged a pleasure cruise along the Thames that summer, a customary and usually delightful excursion for the royal family, only to be forced to turn the vessel back after a matter of minutes, the smell rising from the water proving unbearable even from the comparative safety of a well-appointed royal barge. If a reigning queen could not endure a short pleasure cruise upon the river without retreating in evident distress, the scale of what ordinary Londoners were enduring on a daily basis becomes considerably easier to appreciate. The building's administrators, in a response that will become one of the summer's more darkly comic footnotes, attempt to address the problem by soaking the heavy curtains that hang in the affected rooms with chloride of lime, a chemical compound believed at the time to have disinfecting and deodorizing properties. For a few days, this appears to offer some marginal relief. Then the heat overwhelms even the chemical treatment, and the curtains themselves begin to contribute their own unpleasant note to the general atmosphere. Chloride of lime mixing with river stench to produce something that several accounts describe as if anything worse than the original smell alone. Edmund returns home that evening later than usual, having stayed to finish the day's correspondence in a nearly empty office building, most of his colleagues having found reasons to leave early rather than endure the afternoon's especially sharp intensity of odor. He walks the 3 miles home rather than taking a cab, partly to save the expense, but partly, he admits to Louisa once he arrives, because walking gave him something to occupy his attention besides the smell that seemed to follow him the entire distance, clinging to his coat, to his hair, to the inside of his own nose, in a way that no amount of fresh air along the walk seemed able to dislodge. The walk itself takes him along streets that, in cooler weather, he actually enjoys, past the grand facades of Victoria Street, through smaller residential lanes where the evening light catches the brick in a warm amber glow that he has always found quietly satisfying after a long day of paperwork. Tonight, that pleasure is almost entirely absorbed by discomfort. The heat of the day lingers stubbornly in the pavement beneath his boots and his wool coat, which he does not dare remove despite the temptation, grows heavier with every block, sweat gathering beneath his collar in a way that he has learned over this long summer to simply accept rather than fight. He passes other men making the same walk, similarly dressed, similarly silent, each of them wearing an expression of grim endurance that has become, this same July, something close to the default public face of London's professional classes. It is 6:15 when Edmund finally reaches the house, and the family sits down, as they do most evenings, for a meal that Louisa has assembled with considerable care given the day's limited and uncertain provisions: bread, eggs prepared simply, vegetables from the garden, no meat given the morning's disappointing report from the butcher. It is not the meal Louisa would have chosen to serve her husband after a long day at Westminster, but it is a meal she trusts, and in the summer of 1858, trust has become a more valuable quality in food than variety or abundance. Edmund, to his credit, never once complains about the plainness of these summer meals, understanding, without needing to be told, exactly what careful reasoning and quiet worry sits behind each dish Louisa places in front of him, and he thanks her for it each evening with a small, genuine warmth that she has come to rely on more than she would probably admit aloud. Let us step back from the Pemberton's evening table and talk about why an entire city was this afraid of a smell, because the fear itself is central to understanding what this summer actually was. In 1858, the dominant medical theory of disease transmission was miasma theory, the belief that illness spread through bad air, through invisible poisonous vapors released by decaying organic matter, standing water, and unsanitary conditions. This was not a fringe or uneducated belief. It was the mainstream scientific consensus, taught in medical schools, published in respected journals, and accepted by the vast majority of physicians practicing in London at the time. The theory traced its roots back over 2,000 years to ancient Greek medicine, and it had persisted in one form or another through every century since, reinforced generation after generation. The theory had genuine explanatory power in certain respects. Diseases did seem to cluster in areas with poor sanitation and offensive smells, What miasma theory got wrong was the mechanism. It was the contaminated water and the unsanitary conditions that produced both the smell and the disease simultaneously. Correlated, but not causally connected in the way the theory assumed. For a Londoner living through the summer of 1858, however, this distinction meant almost nothing in practical terms. If you believed, as nearly everyone did, that bad air caused cholera, then the Great Stink was not merely unpleasant. It was a visible, physical manifestation of a cloud of death hanging over the entire city, a toxic atmosphere that could, at any moment, settle into your lungs and end your life or the life of your child. This is not a metaphor. Contemporary accounts describe the smell in exactly these terms, as something approaching a biological weapon, an invisible killer riding on every breath of air that moved through the city's streets. And the fear was not baseless, even if the mechanism was misunderstood. London had already suffered 3 serious cholera outbreaks in the preceding decades, each one devastating, each one concentrated in the poorer, more densely populated districts where sanitation was worst. The outbreak of 1848 and 1849 alone killed more than 14,000 Londoners. A second wave in 1853 claimed nearly 11,000 more. These were not distant statistics to a Londoner living in 1858. They were recent memory, the kind of loss that touched nearly every extended family and every neighborhood in the city in some form, and the fear that a heat wave of this severity might trigger a 4th such outbreak. It was based on everything Londoners had already lived through, a thoroughly reasonable expectation. A physician named John Snow had, several years earlier, conducted a careful investigation into one of these outbreaks and concluded that the disease was spreading not through bad air, but through contaminated water, specifically through a single public pump on Broad Street whose water supply had been fouled by a nearby cesspit. Snow's method was, by the standards of the era, remarkably rigorous. He mapped every case of the illness across the affected neighborhood, tracing each one back to its source of drinking water, and found the pattern converging again and again on the same contaminated pump, when local authorities, largely as a precaution rather than out of any conviction that Snow's theory was correct, removed the pump's handle to prevent further use. The outbreak in that specific neighborhood subsided. Snow's conclusion was correct, and it represents one of the founding achievements of modern epidemiology, the careful, evidence-based tracing of a disease back to its actual physical cause rather than to a vague and unfalsifiable atmospheric theory. But Snow's theory remained controversial and largely unaccepted by the medical establishment throughout his lifetime. The prevailing scientific consensus was simply too entrenched, too thoroughly woven into the training of every physician and the assumptions of every public health official for one man's careful map-making to overturn it quickly. Snow died in June of 1858 at the very height of the Great Stink, without ever seeing his waterborne theory of cholera vindicated by mainstream medical opinion. It would take several more years and considerably more evidence before the medical establishment fully accepted what Snow had already demonstrated. So, as the heatwave dragged into its 2nd and 3rd months, and as cholera cases inevitably began appearing in the poorer districts closest to the river, the response of most Londoners and most of the authorities responsible for public health was shaped by a fundamentally mistaken understanding of what was actually dangerous. People who feared the water correctly avoided the Thames itself. But people who trusted the miasma theory's implicit reassurance that clean-looking, clean-tasting water from a local pump was safe continued drinking from sources that were in reality contaminated by the same sewage seeping through London soil. The very pumps that people trusted precisely because the water looked clear and did not carry the overwhelming stench of the river, were in many cases drawing from groundwater that had been fouled by nearby cesspits and leaking sewers. The population's fear was correctly aimed at disease. It was simply aimed, in many specific instances, at the wrong culprit, while the actual danger continued flowing invisibly through pipes. The authorities' response to the crisis reflected this same fundamental misunderstanding. If bad air caused disease, then the solution to a public health emergency caused by bad air was to neutralize the air itself. Through July of 1858, workers dumped enormous quantities of chemical treatments directly into the Thames, an increasingly desperate attempt to control the smell. Chalk lime, chloride of lime, carbolic acid. Over 200 tons of lime were poured into the river near the mouths of the sewers in a single early push, and the liming process continued in fits and starts through the remainder of the summer and into the following year. Workers in small boats moved along the exposed banks at low tide, shoveling the chemical treatment directly onto the exposed mounds of sewage that the falling river level had revealed. A task must have ranked among the least desirable forms of employment available in London that summer. The results were at best marginal, and at worst actively counterproductive. The chemicals did little to address the underlying volume of untreated sewage pouring into the river every single day, because pouring disinfectant onto an ocean of waste while the waste itself continues arriving at the same overwhelming rate treats a symptom. What the chemicals did accomplish, in many documented instances, was to add an entirely new and distinct chemical odor on top of the existing biological stench, so that Londoners in certain neighborhoods found themselves breathing a combination of fermenting sewage and industrial disinfectant. Unbearable than either smell would have been on its own. One historic account describes a wry local joke that made the rounds that summer. The observation that the authorities had apparently succeeded in inventing an entirely new smell without managing to eliminate the old one. And all of this was unfolding against a backdrop of a food supply that had become its own quiet source of danger, made significantly worse by the heat. This is a theme this channel has returned to before: the systematic adulteration of Victorian food. And the summer of 1858 shows exactly how a public health crisis can compound an existing, ongoing one. Milk, without any means of refrigeration, spoiled within hours in the summer heat, and the dairymen supplying London's households responded not by improving their handling, but by disguising the problem, adding water to stretch supply, adding chalk to restore a convincing color, employing whatever additive might mask the taste and smell of milk on the edge of turning. Meat rotted within a single day in temperatures that regularly exceeded 90 degrees, and butchers across the city faced the same pressure that Louisa's own butcher describes to her: an impossible daily race against decay that some, inevitably, lost. Selling meat that should have been discarded to customers who had no reliable way of detecting the danger until it was too late. Beyond milk and meat, the broader pattern of Victorian food adulteration touched nearly every category of food a household like the Pembertons might purchase. Bread was frequently bulked out with alum or chalk to stretch a baker's flour supply and reduce his costs, a practice that interfered with digestion and over-sustained exposure contributed to malnutrition and bone disorders in children who consumed it daily for years. Confectionery sold to children was in some of the era's most notorious cases colored with substances containing genuine poisons, a scandal that had already claimed lives in the years just before this heatwave, and that remained a subject of public horror and outrage. Vinegar was cut with sulfuric acid. Cocoa powder was thickened with starch. The list compiled by the era's few dedicated food chemists who had begun testing products and publishing their alarming findings, ran to dozens of common household items, each one adulterated in some manner that traded consumer safety for producer profit. The heat did not create Victorian food adulteration. That problem had existed for decades, a quiet, chronic danger woven into the everyday business of feeding a rapidly growing industrial city. But the heat amplified every existing danger simultaneously. Spoilage happened faster. The margin for error shrank to almost nothing. And a population already living under the psychological weight of a miasma they believed might kill them at any moment now faced the added compounding fear that the very food on their tables might be doing the same thing through an entirely different and equally invisible mechanism. The smell got so bad as the summer wore toward its peak in mid-July that it finally reached the one place in London that had always assumed itself immune to the consequences of the city's failures. We turn now to Westminster, because what happened there is where this story turns. But first, we should finish the evening in Pimlico, because the Pemberton's night carries its own quiet weight that deserves to be told in full before we return to the larger political drama unfolding a few miles away. After the evening meal, as the heat inside the house shows no sign of the relief that a cooler climate would normally bring after sunset, Louisa receives a visitor at the door. It is Mrs. Halloran, a neighbor from 2 doors down, her face drawn and pale in a way that immediately alarms Louisa before a single word has been spoken. Mrs. Blank. Halloran's youngest child, a boy of 4, has fallen seriously ill over the course of the afternoon, gripped by a violent stomach complaint that came on with alarming speed and has left the child weak, feverish, and unable to keep down even water. Cholera announces itself in the mid-19th century with a speed that modern illness rarely matches. A person can wake feeling entirely well and be dangerously, even fatally, ill by evening. The disease progressing through violent vomiting and diarrhea that drains the body of fluid at a rate the era's medicine has almost no meaningful way to counteract. Halloran does not use the word cholera when she speaks to Louisa at the door, because to speak the word aloud is to invite a kind of fate that no mother wants to name directly, but both women understand, without needing to say it plainly, exactly what fear is standing between them on the doorstep. Mrs. Bray, Halloran's husband, works, as it happens, at a modest trading office not far from the docks, and the family occupies a house only slightly smaller and slightly less comfortable than the Pembertons' own, close enough in circumstance that Louisa recognizes that whatever separates her own household from this sudden crisis is a matter of narrow, largely arbitrary fortune rather than any genuine difference in safety. The Hallorans draw their water from the same general supply as the Pembertons. Their milk arrives through much the same chain of handling. Their proximity to the river's worst effects is nearly identical. If the illness gripping the youngest Halloran child had instead settled on Alice, Louisa understands, standing at her own front door, listening to her neighbor's carefully controlled voice, fray at the edges, there would have been very little separating that outcome from this one beyond simple chance. Louisa offers what small comfort and practical help she can. She sends Bridget over with clean linens and a jug of boiled cold water on the theory common among cautious households of the time that boiling water might purify it of whatever miasma or contamination it carried, a theory that happens, for reasons the era does not yet understand, to actually work, though not for the reasons anyone in 1858 would have given. She offers to sit with the child for an hour so that Mrs. Halloran might rest, an offer that is gratefully but firmly declined, because a mother in this situation does not leave her child's bedside for anything short of absolute necessity. Louisa also offers, somewhat more hesitantly, to send for the family's own physician, a Dr. Whitfield, who has attended the Pembertons through Alice's occasional childhood ailments, but Mrs. Graypier Halloran explains that her own physician has already been sent for and is expected within the hour, delayed only by the sheer volume of similar calls he has apparently been receiving throughout the district over the preceding days. This last detail lands on Louisa with real weight. If a single physician is fielding multiple urgent calls within the same small neighborhood on the same afternoon, the crisis has clearly moved beyond an isolated unfortunate case and into something approaching a genuine local outbreak, the exact scenario that every household in London has spent this entire summer quietly. Louisa returns to her own house afterward, carrying a fear that she does not fully voice to Edmund, though he can read it plainly enough on her face when she comes back inside. She goes immediately to check on Alice, who is sleeping fitfully in the heat, but shows no sign of the illness that has struck the Halloran boy. And Louisa stands over the small bed for longer than strictly necessary, watching her daughter's chest rise and fall before she finally allows herself to step away. Ward reaches the Pembertons 2 days later, through the same network of servants and neighbors that had first carried news of the boy's illness, that he has survived, though the recovery has left him weak and thin, in a way his mother finds difficult to look at without weeping. He is fortunate. Across the poorer districts of London this same week, similar cases are ending very differently, and the weekly mortality figures published in the newspapers, a grim but standard feature of Victorian journalism, show a marked rise in deaths attributed to what the registrars still call, in the language of the era, bowel complaints and summer diarrhea. Terms that obscure, behind their clinical blandness, the same violent, rapid illness that so nearly claimed the Halloran boy. This is the texture of an ordinary evening during the Great Stink for a family like the Pembertons. Not constant dramatic terror, but a low, persistent undercurrent of watchfulness, a habit of checking on a sleeping child slightly more often than usual, of eyeing a jug of milk with new suspicion, of listening for the specific knock at the door that might mean a neighbor needs help. Or worse, the heat itself is miserable, the smell is nearly unbearable. But underneath both of these discomforts sits something sharper, a genuine fear for the survival of the people you love most, running quietly through every hour of a summer that refuses to end. Edmund and Louisa sit together in the small parlor after Alice has finally settled into a deeper sleep, the windows open despite the smell, because the alternative, sealing the house against the outside air entirely, would make the indoor heat truly unbearable. Edmund tells her in more detail than his letter to his brother contained, about the scene at Parliament that day, about the committee member who fled the room, about the curtains soaked in chloride of lime that seem, if anything, to have made matters worse. Louisa listens and finds herself asking the question that has been forming in her mind for weeks now, the question that half of London seems to be asking in one form or another. Why has nothing been done? Why does a government capable of building the very building Edmund works in each day, a government that commands an empire spanning a quarter of the globe, seem entirely unable to fix a problem that every person in this city can smell from their own front step? Edmund does not have a satisfying answer. He mentions vaguely that there has been talk for years of a comprehensive plan to overhaul London's sewers, a plan championed by an engineer named Bazalgette who works for the Metropolitan Board of Works, but that the necessary funding has never quite materialized, blocked by disputes over cost, over which authority should bear responsibility, over the sheer scale of what such a project would require. It is, Edmund says, the kind of problem that everyone agrees is urgent, and no one has been willing to actually pay to solve. He tells her, with the quiet weariness of a man who spends his working hours close enough to power to see its limitations clearly, that he has heard the same arguments repeated in one form or another for as long as he has worked at Westminster, always ending in the same conclusion. The matter can wait another session. Louisa's response, quiet but pointed, is one that Edmund will remember and repeat, in one form or another, for years afterward. Perhaps, she says, it will take the smell reaching Parliament itself before anyone in a position to fix it actually feels compelled to. She does not know, as she says this, how prophetic the observation will prove to be. Let us step back from the Pemberton's parlour and look at what was actually happening inside the Houses of Parliament that summer, because Louisa's quiet observation turns out to be almost exactly correct, and the story of how it played out is one of the more darkly instructive episodes in the entire history of British governance. For years before the summer of 1858, the problem of London's sewage had been well understood by the small circle of engineers, physicians, and civic officials who studied it closely. Joseph Bazalgette, the chief engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works, had already drafted comprehensive plans for an entirely new sewer system, one that would intercept waste before it reached the Thames and carry it far downstream, to be released only where the tide could disperse it without poisoning the drinking water and the air of 2.5 million people. Bazalgette was, by 1858, already a seasoned civil engineer in his late 30s, a man who had spent years studying London's existing drainage in exhaustive detail, walking the tunnels and cataloguing the failures of a system that had grown by accident. He understood, with a precision that few of his contemporaries shared, exactly how large a project would be required to fix the problem properly, and exactly how much such a project would cost. The plans existed. The engineering expertise existed. What did not exist was the political will, or more precisely, the funding, because a project of this scale required an enormous financial commitment, and the various authorities responsible for London's governance had spent years arguing over who should bear the cost and how it should be structured. While the underlying problem continued to worsen with every year the population grew, Bazalgette had submitted variations of his plan for review on multiple occasions throughout the 1,850 seconds, and on each occasion, the proposal had been debated, picked apart, sent back for revision, or simply left to languish without a clear decision. The kind of bureaucratic paralysis that afflicts any large institution asked to commit enormous sums of money to a problem that, serious as it may be, remains largely invisible to the people holding the purse strings, so long as that problem stays confined to the parts of the city those people rarely visit. Then came the heat wave, and then came the smell. And then, in the last 2 weeks of June, the smell finally crossed a threshold that no amount of political inertia could withstand. The Houses of Parliament, as we have already discussed, sit directly on the riverbank, and by late June, the terrace where members traditionally took the air had become entirely unusable, the stench rising directly off the exposed, baking mudflats of the Thames at low tide. The library, which faces the river, became so afflicted that staff reportedly could not remain inside it for more than a few minutes at a time. Committee rooms overlooking the water were repeatedly abandoned mid-session. Members conducted what business they could while holding handkerchiefs pressed against their faces, a scene that several contemporary newspapers reported with an unmistakable note of satisfaction, having spent years complaining, largely without effect, about the very sewage problem that was now making the nation's lawmakers physically ill in their own chamber. The first response, as we have already described, was an attempt to soak the heavy curtains hanging in the affected rooms with chloride of lime, in the hope that the chemical's disinfecting properties might neutralize the smell before it fully penetrated the building's interior. For a brief period, this appeared to offer some marginal relief, and administrators congratulated themselves on having found a practical solution to an impossible problem. Then the heat intensified further. The smell outside grew stronger still, and the treated curtains began to fail, the chemical treatment overwhelmed by the sheer volume and concentration of what it was attempting to counteract. By the end of June, the situation had become truly untenable. Serious proposals were floated to relocate parliamentary business entirely away from Westminster, to Oxford, or to St. Lou. Albans, abandoning the newly constructed Houses of Parliament, built at enormous expense only a decade earlier, because the building had become physically uninhabitable during the very months when government business was supposed to proceed. This proposal was, after some consideration, dropped, likely on the grounds that relocating the entire apparatus of British government would have been an admission of failure, too embarrassing, and too logistically complicated. Instead, on the 15th of July 1858, Benjamin Disraeli, then serving as Chancellor of the Exchequer, rose in the House of Commons, described the Thames, in words that would be quoted for generations afterward, as a Stygian pool, reeking with ineffable and intolerable horrors. This was not merely colourful rhetoric, it was the opening move in an almost unprecedented display of legislative speed. Disraeli put the necessary legislation before Parliament that same day, authorising the Metropolitan Board of Works to proceed immediately with Bazalgette's long-delayed sewer plan, and granting the authority to borrow up to £3 million, an almost inconceivable sum for civic infrastructure at the time, to fund its construction. The bill became law on the 2nd of August. 18 days. A problem that had been debated, delayed, and deferred for years was solved, at least on paper, in barely more than 2 weeks, once the smell reached close enough to the people with the power to act on it. There is a specific irony worth noting in the fact that it was Disraeli himself, a man not typically remembered for grand public health reform, who delivered the speech that broke years of deadlock. Disraeli's own account of his experience visiting the river's edge that summer, which he shared with colleagues shortly before his famous speech, describes a scene of almost apocalyptic squalor, and it seems to have affected him with a directness that years of written reports and petitions from concerned physicians. There is something worth sitting with in this. It was not the accumulated weight of careful argument and evidence patiently assembled by men like John Snow that finally moved the government to act. It was, quite simply, a powerful man being forced to smell with his own senses the thing that poorer Londoners had been smelling and living beside for years. The influence of what followed extended well beyond London's own borders. Once Bazalgette's sewer system began demonstrating its effectiveness through the 1,860 seconds and early 1,870 seconds, engineers and civic planners in cities across the world took notice. Paris had already begun its own major sewer expansion under a separate initiative, and the two projects, London's and Paris's, became reference points that planners in cities from Berlin to New York studied closely as they confronted their own versions of the same underlying problem. Non-industrial cities that had grown far faster than their sanitary infrastructure could keep pace with. The Great Stink, in this sense, became not merely a London crisis, but an inadvertent case study for an entire century of urban sanitation reform, a single, spectacularly unpleasant summer that helped establish for cities around the globe the basic principle that a growing population required infrastructure planned generations ahead, rather than infrastructure that simply reacted to each new crisis as it arrived. There is more to understand here, and it deserves to be said plainly. The engineering solution to London's sewage crisis had existed for years before 1858. The suffering of London's poorest residents, who lived closest to the river, who drank most directly from its contaminated tributaries, who had died in cholera outbreaks by the thousands in the decades before this heatwave had not been sufficient motivation to secure the funding this project required. It took the smell reaching the windows of Parliament itself, the discomfort of the wealthy and the powerful, to finally break years of bureaucratic paralysis. This is worth sitting with for a moment. The poor of London had been breathing this same air, drinking this same poisoned water, burying their children to the same waterborne diseases, for as long as anyone could remember. Their suffering was documented, discussed, even lamented in Parliament itself on occasion. And it was not, however, considered urgent enough to justify the cost of a solution until that same suffering, in a slightly different and far more concentrated form, arrived at the doorstep of the people who held the purse strings. The contrast between how different classes of London experienced this same summer deserves its own careful attention. Wealthy families with the means to do so left the city entirely for the duration of the worst heat, retreating to country estates or seaside towns where the air was clean and the temperature more bearable. Charles Dickens himself, whose novels had done more than perhaps any other writers to expose the conditions of London's sewage and its poor, left the city in July and August for an extended and, by his own account, highly successful reading tour, escaping the very crisis his own work had helped bring to public attention. Members of Parliament, once the legislation was secured, could retreat to their own country homes for the remainder of the summer recess, leaving the machinery of reform to grind forward at its own pace while they enjoyed cleaner air elsewhere. The poor of London had no such option. Families in Bethnal Green, in Whitechapel, in the crowded courts and tenements closest to the river and its worst affected tributaries, could not simply leave. Their livelihoods, their employment, their entire social and economic existence was tied to the city itself, and a labourer who abandoned his post for the summer risked losing his position entirely, a risk that few families in genuine poverty could afford to take. They endured the heat and the smell and the very real threat of cholera in homes that offered none of the middle-class Pemberton's modest comforts, homes often lacking even the possibility of a garden's worth of trusted vegetables or eggs. Conditions in these poorer districts were, by every account that survives, considerably worse than anything the Pembertons experienced in Pimlico. Entire families frequently occupied a single room, sometimes sharing that room with lodgers taken in to help cover rent that consumed a punishing share of a labourer's modest wages. Water for these households often came not from a private tap but from a shared standpipe or pump serving an entire court of buildings, a pump that might run for only a few hours on certain days of the week, forcing residents to store what water they could collect in whatever containers were available. Containers that offered no real barrier against contamination and that sat through the worst of the heat, breeding whatever organisms had found their way into the supply. Sanitation in these neighborhoods relied on shared privies, sometimes a single facility serving dozens of households, connected to cesspits that had rarely been emptied with any regularity even before this summer's crisis compounded every existing failure of the system. Cholera, when it struck these neighborhoods, moved through them with a speed and a lethality that the more spacious, better provisioned households of Pimlico rarely experienced in quite the same concentrated form. A single contaminated water source serving dozens of families could produce dozens of cases within the same terrible week, overwhelming what little medical care was available in these districts and leaving the poor to bury their dead at a pace that outstripped anything a wealthier neighborhood was ever forced to confront. They endured it because they had no alternative, while the crisis that would eventually save their grandchildren from a repeat of this same nightmare was finally set in motion, not by their suffering which had continued for decades, but by the discomfort of men who governed a nation, to smell what their own negligence had created. Bazalgette's project, once funding was secured, would take nearly 2 decades to complete in its full scope, an engineering achievement of staggering ambition involving over 1,000 miles of new sewer tunnels, massive pumping stations at Deptford and at Abbey Mills, and the construction of the great riverside embankments that still define London's relationship with the Thames today. The scale of the undertaking is difficult to overstate. Bazalgette's engineers calculated the necessary capacity of the new sewer network, and then, in a decision that would prove remarkably prescient, doubled it, reasoning that a growing city would eventually need far more capacity than its current population required. That single decision, born of an engineer's careful foresight rather than any political mandate, is a significant part of why much of Bazalgette's original system remains in active use to this day, well over a century and a half after it was first designed. The project would, by the time it was substantially finished in the mid-1870s, virtually eliminate the waterborne cholera outbreaks that had killed tens of thousands of Londoners across the preceding decades. It stands still as one of the great triumphs of Victorian civil engineering, a genuine gift to every generation of Londoners who followed, the invisible infrastructure beneath the modern city that its current residents rarely think about precisely because it has worked so consistently well for so long. But it is worth remembering, every time that achievement is celebrated, exactly what it took to finally set it into motion. Not the deaths of the poor, which had been ongoing and well documented for years. The smell, finally, reaching a window that mattered. Let us return now, one last time, to the Pembertons, because their small, private evening still has one quiet scene left to tell. But before we return to that small, private scene, let us step back and look at the whole shape of what we have watched tonight, because there are patterns here that deserve to be named plainly. The first pattern is the gap between the appearance of a society and its actual physical reality. We remember the Victorian era through its surfaces, its formal manners, its elegant clothing, its grand architecture. But underneath every one of those surfaces in the summer of 1858 sat a body enduring genuine physical suffering, sweating inside sealed layers of fabric, breathing air that its own inhabitants believed might kill them, drinking water. A society's polish and its underlying health are not the same thing, and the gap between them can grow far wider than anyone examining only the surface would ever suspect. The paintings and portraits that survive from this era show composed faces and elegant postures. They do not show the sweat soaking through a corset cover, or the dizziness that a woman pushed silently through her afternoon, or the private fear a mother carried checking her sleeping child's breathing one more time than strictly necessary. The second pattern is the way that social codes can override even basic biological need. Louisa's inability to loosen her collar or remove a layer of clothing in public heat that modern medicine would recognize as actually dangerous was not a personal failing or an excess of vanity. It was the product of a social system so thoroughly internalized that violating it felt, to the women who lived within it, like a greater risk than heat stroke itself. The body's demand for relief and the culture's demand for propriety were placed in direct opposition, and for the vast majority of Victorian women, propriety won, not because they lacked judgment, but because the consequences of losing social standing were, in the world they actually inhabited, more immediately catastrophic than the risk of physical suffering. A woman could recover from heat exhaustion in an afternoon of quiet rest. A woman's reputation, once damaged by a public accusation of impropriety, might never fully recover at all, and that asymmetry, however irrational it appears from the distance of another century, shaped the daily choices of millions of women with a force that modern observers sometimes struggle to take seriously enough. The third pattern is the selective urgency of power. The engineering solution to London's sewage crisis existed for years before anyone with the authority to fund it treated the problem as genuinely urgent. The suffering of London's poor, extensively documented, repeatedly discussed, was not sufficient to move that urgency forward. It took the same crisis reaching the people who held the purse strings in a form concentrated and inescapable enough to disrupt their own daily comfort before decades of delay collapsed into 18 days of frantic legislation. This is not a pattern unique to Victorian London. It is a pattern that recurs across history whenever those with the power to solve a problem are sufficiently insulated from that problem's consequences. And it is worth recognizing precisely because it recurs so often and so quietly in forms that rarely announce themselves as clearly as a river turning into an open sewer. The fourth pattern is the invisible labor of maintaining appearances. Bridget lacing Louisa's corset each morning. Louisa's careful, anxious inspection of milk and meat before she would trust either near her daughter. The countless small, unrecorded acts of labor and vigilance that kept a household like the Pembertons functioning through a crisis that threatened, in ways both obvious and hidden, everyone within it. This labor rarely appears in the grand historical narrative of the Great Stink, which tends to focus on Parliament, on Disraeli's famous speech, on Bazalgette's engineering triumph. But it was this quieter, domestic labor, performed almost entirely by women and servants, that determined whether individual families actually survived the summer intact. History remembers the men who legislated the solution. It rarely remembers the women who, in the meantime, kept their households alive through weeks of daily, exhausting vigilance that left no monument and no memorial plaque. Consider everything that labor actually involved laid out plainly. Bridget, rising before dawn to light a fire, she would then have to endure all morning in a small attic room that trapped heat long after the rest of the house had cooled. Louisa standing for the better part of an hour each morning while she was laced into a garment she could not remove again until nightfall, regardless of how the temperature climbed. The daily, almost ritual inspection of milk and meat, performed with no scientific instrument beyond a trained eye and a cautious nose, a woman's judgment standing as the only real defense between her family and a food supply that had become, this same summer, considerably more dangerous than usual. Quiet vigilance over a sleeping child's breathing, repeated night after night, a form of watchfulness that produces no visible product and appears in no historical record, but that determined, in the most literal sense, whether specific families made it through this crisis. None of this appears on a monument. All of it mattered enormously. The fifth pattern is how thin the margin of safety actually was for everyone, regardless of class. They had a servant, a garden, a husband with steady income and a respectable position. And yet, a single heatwave, combined with an aging sewage system that had simply outgrown the city it was meant to serve, brought even a household like theirs to the edge of genuine danger, watching a neighbor's child fall gravely ill, questioning whether the morning's milk could be trusted, wondering whether the very air moving through their windows carried something that might kill them. If comfort and status offered this little real protection, the vulnerability of London's poor who possessed neither is almost impossible to fully imagine, though it is worth trying. It is worth remembering, too, that the margin separating comfort from catastrophe in 1858 was not primarily a matter of wealth in the way we might assume today. It was a matter of infrastructure, of whether the invisible systems beneath the city actually functioned as intended, And infrastructure of that kind protects everyone within its reach or protects no one at all. A sewer system either safely carries waste away from a city's drinking water, or it does not. And when it does not, the resulting danger does not stay neatly confined to the neighborhoods that can least afford to escape it. It rises, quite literally, on the tide, and it settles over the whole city in equal measure, even if the poor, lacking any means of retreat, bore the worst and most concentrated share of what followed. The sixth and final pattern is the strange and comfortable truth that disaster is often only reliable engine of genuine reform. It would be satisfying to believe that a society capable of identifying a problem clearly as London's engineers and physicians had identified the sewage crisis for years before 1858 would act on that knowledge simply because it was correct. The story of the Great Stink suggests something less flattering about how institutions actually behave. Correct knowledge, patiently assembled and repeatedly presented, moved almost nothing forward for years. It took an environmental catastrophe severe enough to physically drive the nation's lawmakers from their own chambers before the same correct knowledge, unchanged in its substance, was finally acted upon with real urgency. Progress, in this specific story, and perhaps in a great many others, arrived, not because anyone became wiser, but because suffering finally became impossible for the powerful to ignore. Now let us return finally to the Pembertons' small parlour, because the night is not quite finished and the ending matters. It is nearly 11 o'clock when Louisa and Edmund finally climb the stairs to their bedroom. The heat inside the house still oppressive despite the late hour. The windows still open despite the faint, persistent smell that drifts through them on whatever small movement of air the night offers. Edmund pauses at the top of the stairs to check once more on Alice, a habit he has developed this same summer that Louisa finds quietly touching, a father's own version of the vigilance that has otherwise fallen so heavily on her alone through these long, uncertain weeks. He falls asleep quickly once he finally settles into bed, exhausted by the day's heat and the walk home and the low grinding stress of watching his own government fail to address a crisis that everyone in the city could smell for themselves. Louisa lies awake a while longer, listening to the house settle around her, listening for any sound from Alice's room that might signal trouble, and hearing only the small, steady breathing of a child who has, for tonight at least, been spared whatever fate befell the Halloran boy 2 doors down. She thinks of Mrs. Halloran, still awake at this hour, almost certainly keeping her own vigil beside a bed that Louisa desperately hopes will not become the kind of bed. She finally allows herself to remove the last few pins from her hair, letting it fall loose over her shoulders in the dark. A small private relief after a full day spent maintaining the careful, structured appearance that respectability demanded of her from the moment she woke until the moment the household's doors were finally locked for the night. This too is a small freedom rarely discussed in the grand histories of this era, the specific exhaustion of maintaining a controlled physical presentation through hours of genuine discomfort, and the quiet, private relief of finally, the darkness of her own bedroom, being allowed simply to exist. She reaches for the small stack of magazines on her nightstand, the serialized novel she has been following for weeks now, and reads a few pages by the light of a single candle, because sleep does not come easily in this heat, and the familiar comfort of an ongoing story offers something that nothing else in this same summer quite manages to provide. Tonight's installment finds its heroine facing a crisis of her own, though a considerably more romantic and considerably less biologically threatening one than the crisis unfolding across London this same summer. And Louisa finds strange, small comfort in the contrast, in the reminder that ordinary human dramas, courtship and misunderstanding, and eventual reconciliation continue to unfold in the pages of a magazine, even while the city outside her window struggles with something far more serious. It is a small, private pleasure, entirely her own, unconnected to duty or propriety or the crushing weight of a city slowly discovering the true cost of its own negligence. She reads until her eyes grow heavy, then she blows out the candle and lies in the dark, listening to Edmund's steady breathing beside her, and Alice's steady breathing through the thin wall, separating their rooms, and allows herself, finally, to hope that tomorrow, a change in the wind, a single degree less of heat, some sign, however small, that the summer is not going to last forever. It will, in fact, last several more weeks before the heat finally breaks in September. The temperature dropping gradually as autumn approaches and the immediate crisis of the smell fading along with it. The river's flow gradually restored by cooler weather and eventual rain. The tide, once again, diluting what it had been unable to disguise through the worst weeks of July. The cholera cases in the poorer districts will continue for some time longer, a slower and less visible tragedy than the dramatic headlines of Parliament fleeing its own chambers, but a tragedy nonetheless, claiming lives in neighbourhoods that received considerably less attention from the newspapers than the discomfort of members of Parliament had managed to attract. But the legislation is already moving through Parliament by the time Louisa closes her eyes that night, though she does not yet know it. And within 2 decades, the child sleeping in the next room will grow up in a London where a summer like this one, the sewage baking in the heat, the cholera creeping through the poorer districts, the impossible choice between suffocating heat and suffocating stench will have become, thanks to Bazalgette's tunnels running silently beneath the streets, something that belongs entirely to the past. Alice will grow into a young woman who has never known a Thames that smelled the way it smelled that July, who will hear stories from her mother about the summer of the Great Stink, the way children of later generations hear stories about disasters their parents survived, with a mixture of fascination, protected disbelief that things could really have been quite so bad. None of this is comfort Louisa can draw on tonight. Tonight, she simply lies in the heat, in a house that smells faintly of a river that should not smell like anything at all, beside a husband who spent his day fleeing a stench inside the very building where the nation's laws are made, and hopes, in the quiet, private way that people have always hoped through difficult nights, that her family will simply make it through to morning. The house is quiet now. The candle has gone out. Somewhere beyond the window, the Thames continues its slow, fermenting work in the dark, indifferent to the 2.5 million people whose fate is tied to its banks, indifferent to the engineers already drafting the tunnels that will eventually tame it, indifferent to the small, de-exhausted family finally drifting towards sleep, a narrow house in Pimlico, waiting, like the rest of the city, for the summer to finally, mercifully, end. Tomorrow begins before tonight has quite finished, but that is tomorrow's story. For now, sleep, wherever you are, whatever the hour. I hope the air around you is cleaner than the air in this story, and I hope this was good company on a warm night. Sleep well, friend. We have been somewhere real tonight.